I'm Emily, 30 years old. 2 weeks ago, at my birthday, my mother gave me a gift I'll never forget. Imagine 40 guests, a five-star restaurant, and candles glowing on a cake. Then, my mother grabs the microphone. She announces I was adopted purely as a tax benefit, that I was never really family, that 30 years of trying to belong meant nothing. My sister laughed, my father looked away. But they didn't know I had an envelope in my purse from my grandmother, a secret that would make my mother run from her own party. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to know who's part of our community. The silence that followed my mother's announcement didn't feel like a void. It felt like a balance sheet finally being tallied. I looked at Jennifer, whose hand was still gripping the microphone like a scepter. I looked at the 40 guests, their faces frozen in a mix of high society shock and predatory curiosity. At the end of the table, Victoria was staring at her phone, her thumb tapping the screen. I saw the familiar red heart float up on her display. She was double tapping the live stream of my own public execution. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Sadness is an emotion for those who still have something to lose, and in that 1 minute speech, Jennifer had stripped away the last of my emotional debt. I realized then that my relationship with this family had never been a bond of blood. It had been a high-interest subscription, and I was finally canceling the service. I stood up, slowly. The chair, wrapped in its mocking silk ribbon, scraped against the marble floor. The sound was sharp, clinical, like a scalpel. I picked up my emerald clutch. It was heavy with the weight of the envelope Grandma had left me, but more importantly, it held the keys to my own kingdom. I walked out of the Gilded Rose without a single glance back at the woman who had just called me a tax shelter investment. The San Francisco night air was cold, but I felt a sudden, piercing clarity. I walked toward my car, my heels clicking, a steady, rhythmic cadence on the pavement. Once inside, I didn't start the engine. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed with a pale blue light, illuminating the interior of the car. For 3 years, I had been the silent architect behind the prestige of Gregory Holdings. My father, or the man I had called father, was a chief executive officer with a vision, but I was the one with the master architectural licenses. I was the one who had signed off on the structural integrity of his $3 billion skyscraper projects currently rising over the city skyline. My fingers moved across the trackpad with lethal precision. I didn't hesitate. I logged into the state licensing portal and the firm's internal project management system. I filed a formal withdrawal as the architect of record for every active project under the Gregory Holdings banner. In a city as litigious as San Francisco, a multi-billion-dollar construction site without a licensed architect is a massive liability that no insurance company will touch. By the time I hit the final confirmation button, I had triggered an automatic red tag sequence. Within the hour, city inspectors would be on site to halt every crane and stop every concrete pour, effectively turning his three largest skyscrapers into legal dead zones. This wasn't a tantrum. It was a strategic withdrawal of assets. I sat back and watched the spinning loading icon. I had spent 30 years trying to earn a place at a table that was never built for me. I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their social standing while they overdrafted on my compassion for decades. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a shred of regret, but there was only the cold, hard logic of a closed ledger. I had given them my talent, my time, and my loyalty. They had given me a line item in an accounting book. Inside the car, my laptop finally pinged with a confirmation. The licenses were suspended. The notification emails were already hitting Gregory's inbox. This wasn't revenge. It was a simple correction of a long-standing clerical error. They wanted to treat me like a business transaction? Fine. I had just closed the account. I leaned my head against the steering wheel, the cool leather pressing against my forehead. Unprofitable investment. Jennifer's voice hadn't even wavered when she said it. It was the same tone she used when discussing a failing real estate trust or devalued currency. To her, I wasn't a person with a pulse. I was a capital asset that had stopped producing dividends. This was the trap of normalized cruelty. My parents had spent 3 decades convincing themselves and me that their treatment was a form of discipline. They normalized the neglect until it looked like a business strategy. They didn't see the ethics of it because they had replaced their conscience with a ledger. I was brought into their world to bypass a specific inheritance tax clause, a $1 million tax shelter disguised as a child. Once the tax benefit was harvested, I became a maintenance cost they resented. I remembered my years in university. There were no checks from home, no luxury dorms. I worked 3 jobs simultaneously: waitressing at a local diner, pulling graveyard shifts as a security guard, and taking on freelance drafting for pennies. I survived on caffeine and the desperate hope that if I worked hard enough, they would finally see me. Victoria, however, was gifted a brand new Mercedes for her 20th birthday, along with a credit card that had no ceiling. When I asked for help with my textbooks, Gregory told me that self reliance was the greatest inheritance. 2 years ago, that self reliance was the only thing that kept them from the street. Gregory Holdings was facing a $10 million bankruptcy after a massive project in the Mission District stalled. The firm was a house of cards, and the wind was picking up. I was the one who stayed up until 4 in the morning for 6 months straight. I redesigned their internal structural protocols, bypassed a dozen regulatory bottlenecks, and personally lobbied the city board to keep their permits active. I saved their $10 million legacy while I was still paying off the student loans they refused to help with. They didn't celebrate my victory. They didn't even buy me a drink. They simply took the profit and went back to discussing Victoria's social media engagement. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and my talent was the interest they never intended to pay back. Now, they were finding out what happens when the silent pillar decides to walk away. The structural integrity of their world was already failing. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a long overdue audit. I rubbed my eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, the weight of their expectations felt like nothing. It was just a number on a page, and I had just erased it. Jennifer didn't apologize. In her world, an apology was a sign of a failing portfolio, a weakness that invited predators. Instead, she doubled down. Within 24 hours, a carefully worded statement appeared in the San Francisco Social Register. It didn't mention the construction freeze or the architectural licenses. It focused on my tragic mental decline. She painted a picture of a distraught adopted daughter, overwhelmed by the pressure of her 30th birthday, lashing out at the family that had given her everything. Victoria followed suit with a video posted from the balcony of the Nob Hill mansion. She didn't use the sharp, mocking tone from the restaurant. She used a soft, practiced whimper, telling her followers she was terrified of the unstable interloper trying to sabotage their legacy. They weren't shocked by what they'd done to me at dinner. They were shocked that I'd stopped playing along. As I read their lies, I felt the phantom weight of the invisible chains I had carried for 30 years. People often ask why victims stay so long, why they endure the bite of the leash until it draws blood. They don't understand the glass ceiling of identity. When you are told you are an outsider from the age of 5, you don't fight to leave, you fight to prove you're worth keeping. My silence wasn't weakness, it was a survival tactic. I had been pressing my face against that glass ceiling, hoping for a crack of light, a single moment where I was a daughter instead of a tax shelter. The smear campaign was the final hammer blow that shattered that glass. The chains didn't just break, they evaporated. I realized I wasn't an interloper in their legacy. I was the architect of it. And it was time for a professional inspection of the foundations. I drove to the financial district to meet Daniel, my grandmother's former attorney. His office was a fortress of mahogany and silence, a place where secrets went to be archived. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at me with the grim satisfaction of a man holding a winning hand. I handed him the envelope Grandma had left in my safe. She told me to wait until it was absolutely necessary, I said. My voice was clinical. Jennifer and Gregory just made it a necessity. Daniel scanned the documents, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. Your grandmother was a meticulous record keeper, Emily. She knew Jennifer's ambition would eventually outpace her ethics. He set a heavy ledger on the desk. This isn't just about architectural licenses anymore. This is about the $25 million Anderson estate. I looked at the numbers, the property holdings, and the trust accounts. I want a full forensic audit, I told him. I want every wire transfer, every shell company, and every administrative fee Gregory Holdings has charged to the estate over the last 2 decades. I'm not just revoking their right to build, I'm revoking their right to spend. Daniel nodded, already reaching for his phone to summon his team. They wanted to treat you like an unprofitable investment. I think it's time they saw the true cost of their liabilities. I walked out of his office into the bright San Francisco sun. In my head, the ledger was open, and for the first time, the balance was shifting in my favor. I didn't feel angry. Anger is loud and messy. I felt precise, lethal. The audit was beginning, and I knew that once we started digging into the $25 million, we wouldn't just find greed, we would find a crime. The silence of the following week was only broken by the rhythmic ping of emails from Daniel's forensic team. While Jennifer was busy curating her victimhood in the social columns, my world had become a fortress of spreadsheets and scanned documents. Everything stayed quiet for days, but in my head, the words from that birthday dinner kept echoing like a faulty circuit. I wasn't just waiting for an apology I knew would never come. I was waiting for the final tally. Daniel called me into his office at 7 in the evening. The city lights were beginning to blur outside his window, but inside, the light was harsh and uncompromising. He didn't offer me coffee. He simply laid out a series of yellow documents next to a digital audit report. "Emily," he said, his voice dropping to a level of gravity that made the air feel thin. "We didn't just find greed. We found a total erasure of your identity." He pointed to a signature on a trust document from 28 years ago. It was my mother's name, or the woman I believed was my mother. Jennifer and Gregory told the world they adopted a charity case for a tax break, Daniel continued. But the forensic audit of the $25 million Anderson estate tells a different story. You weren't a stranger they rescued. You were a threat they had to neutralize. The lethal discovery was buried in a forged death certificate and a suppressed birth record. My biological mother wasn't some anonymous woman who couldn't care for me. She was Gregory's older sister, the original golden child of the Anderson family and the sole primary heir to the $25 million trust. She had died in an accident when I was 2 years old, but she hadn't died without an heir. She had me. I looked at the documents, my mind functioning with the cold speed of a processor. Jennifer and Gregory hadn't adopted me out of some twisted sense of duty. They had forged the adoption papers and my mother's final estate filings to report that she died without issue. By legally erasing my existence as her daughter, they were able to pivot the entire $25 million inheritance into Gregory's name as the next of kin. The tax benefit Jennifer had bragged about wasn't a deduction, it was a distraction. The $1 million tax shelter they claimed was actually the price they paid to lawyers to keep the forgery airtight. They didn't rescue me. They kidnapped my future to fund their Nob Hill lifestyle. Every meal I had eaten at their table, every hand-me-down I had worn, had been paid for by the very inheritance they stole from me. I didn't feel a surge of grief for the mother I never knew. I felt the sharp, clinical satisfaction of an architect finding the structural flaw that would bring the entire building down. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. This was federal fraud and identity theft on a grand scale. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, but the bank was officially calling in the debt. I looked at Daniel and gave a single, slow nod. "File the criminal complaint," I said. "It's time to show them the real meaning of an unprofitable investment." The scent of expensive perfume and desperation hit the air before Jennifer even spoke. I was sitting in my architectural studio, surrounded by the physical evidence of a career built on my own merit, when she burst through the doors. There were no cameras this time, no audience of 40 guests to applaud her performance. Her eyes were red, her hair was uncharacteristically frayed, and the mask of the San Francisco socialite had finally cracked, revealing the hollow panic underneath. She didn't lead with a toast. She led with a plea. "Emily, you have to stop this," she whispered, her hands trembling as she leaned against my drafting table. "Gregory is being questioned by federal investigators. They're looking at the firm's filings from 20 years ago. They're calling it systematic fraud. If you don't drop the audit and the criminal complaint, everything we've built will be gone in 72 hours. I didn't stand up to greet her. I didn't offer her a chair. I simply leaned back, my expression as clinical as the blueprints spread out before me. This was the power flip climax I had prepared for. The woman who had branded me an unprofitable investment only 2 weeks ago was now standing in my office, begging for a bailout. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was an accounting of every silent year I had endured under her roof. Think about your sister, Jennifer pleaded, her voice rising to a shrill, frantic note. Victoria's social standing is tied to this family. If Gregory goes to prison and the estate is seized, she'll have nothing. We're family, Emily. You've always been the sensible one. Don't let your pride destroy us. I let the word family hang in the air between us like a bad debt. Family sacrifices. Jennifer, I said, my voice steady and cold, that's what you told me when I was working 3 jobs to pay for the textbooks you refused to buy. That's what you said when you used my identity as a tax shelter to fund Victoria's lifestyle. You didn't see me as a daughter then. You saw me as a capital asset. And like any smart investor, I've decided to liquidate my holdings. I pulled a thick manila folder from my desk and slid it across the table. It wasn't an apology. It was the finisher. Inside that folder is the forensic report confirming the identity theft and the forgery of the Anderson Trust documents. I continued. But that's not why I asked you here. I watched her hand shake as she looked at the second document, a court-ordered preliminary injunction and an emergency notice to surrender the property. Because the forensic audit proved this mansion was purchased entirely with stolen funds from my trust, the court has frozen the asset. You have 48 hours to remove your personal effects before the sheriff arrives to execute a lockout and change the security codes. Jennifer stared at the paper, her mouth working soundlessly. You can't do this, she gasped. That is our home. Actually, the audit confirmed that the Nob Hill property was purchased entirely with funds from the Anderson Trust, I replied. The trust that legally belongs to my biological mother's heir. That heir is me. The house, the land, and every piece of furniture inside it are legally mine. I'm not your investment anymore, Jennifer. I'm your landlord. And your lease has officially expired. She collapsed into the chair she hadn't been invited to take, the weight of the 30-year lie finally crushing her. There was no more manipulation left, no more social register smears, just the cold, hard logic of a closed ledger. I went back to my architectural drawings, the sound of my pen on the paper, the only noise in the room. This wasn't revenge, it was justice taking its natural course. I had been the silent pillar for too long, and it was finally time to watch the building fall. The fallout wasn't an explosion, it was a controlled demolition. Gregory Holdings collapsed within 48 hours of my license revocation, but the true end came when the federal fraud charges were unsealed. Gregory was sentenced to 15 years in a federal facility for the systematic forgery of the Anderson Trust documents and the theft of $25 million. Jennifer, the woman who had spent decades curating her social standing with stolen blood, was stripped of every asset. Her social register friends blocked her faster than she had ever blocked me. She moved from the Nob Hill mansion into a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood she used to mock at dinner parties. I stood in the empty foyer of the Nob Hill house, my heels echoing against the cold marble. This was the place where I had been trained to be invisible. For years, I thought justice meant watching them bleed, but standing there with the deeds in my hand, I realized that was too small a goal. Most people think of justice as punishment, an eye for an eye, a dollar for a dollar. They call it the justice of the past. But I decided to choose the justice of the seed sower. Revenge is about destruction. It's about burning down what hurt you until there's nothing left but ash. But the justice of the seed sower is about making the original crime irrelevant. It's about building something so significant that the villain's existence becomes a tiny, forgotten footnote. I had $25 million in liquid assets and a property that represented 30 years of my own exploitation. I wasn't going to spend it on luxury or spite. I used the estate to launch the Heritage Project. I repurposed the Nob Hill property and the $25 million to create a specialized housing and mentorship initiative for foster youth studying architecture and engineering. These weren't charity cases or tax shelters. They were brilliant, capable individuals who, like me, just needed a foundation that wasn't built on lies. My biological mother, the golden aunt they had tried so hard to erase, had been the original visionary of this family. Jennifer and Gregory had tried to turn her legacy into a secret bank account. I was turning it back into a skyline. Watching my first class of students walk through those doors was the ultimate win. I didn't just reclaim my inheritance. I redefined what an inheritance actually is. It's not just the money you're given, it's the cycle you have the courage to break. The morning sun filters through the windows of my new studio in a way it never did at the Nob Hill mansion. The sign above the mahogany door simply says, Emily, no surnames, no corporate holdings, no legacies I didn't build with my own two hands. I spent 30 years under a glass ceiling of identity, looking up at a family that told me I was a line item, a tax shelter, and an unprofitable investment. I bent, I broke, and I auditioned for love that was never going to be granted to someone they saw as a business transaction. But this morning, as I watch the fog roll over the bay, the silence doesn't feel like loneliness. It feels like sovereignty. To those of you who have ever felt like the outsider, the black sheep, or the adopted charity case in your own family, this is my letter to you. You are not a burden. You are not a phase. And you are certainly not a deduction. The people who make you feel small are usually just terrified of how big you could become if you stop asking for their permission to exist. I used to think that revenge was about the kill shot, the public humiliation, or the court verdict. But the best revenge is the quiet morning when you realize their opinion of you was never your truth. It's the moment you stop performing for a table that refuses to hold a seat for you, and you start building your own. Blood may share DNA, but family is a bond that must be earned through kindness, integrity, and support. If they can't provide that, you have every right to close the account and walk away. You don't owe your loyalty to people who profit from your pain. My ledger is finally closed. The debt is paid in full, and the balance is zero. I turned off my laptop, picked up my keys, and walked out into a future that belongs to me alone. If this story resonated with you, or if you've ever had to reclaim your own worth from those who tried to dim it, please share your thoughts in the comments. Let's support each other in building foundations that are actually worth standing on.